Some secrets do not want to be found. They wait, quietly, patiently, beneath roots, beneath years, beneath the weight of forgotten promises. The storm arrived just after midnight, rolling across the Virginia countryside like a slow-moving shadow. Rain tapped against the windows of the old farmhouse, soft at first, then steadier, drumming across the weathered roof that had sheltered generations of the Walker family. Caleb Walker sat awake in the living room, unable to sleep. The house still smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and old memories. 3 weeks had passed since his father's funeral, yet every room carried reminders of the life that had once filled it. A coffee mug left on a shelf, a faded photograph above the fireplace, a jacket hanging near the back door as if someone might return for it tomorrow. Outside, a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the fields stretching beyond the porch. For an instant, the ancient oak tree stood silhouetted against the storm, massive and motionless at the far edge of the property. Then darkness swallowed it again. Caleb rubbed his eyes and glanced toward the dog bed near the fireplace. Empty. That immediately felt wrong. Ranger was never far away. The German Shepherd had been with him for 6 months, and in all that time, the dog rarely left his side without reason. Another flash of lightning lit the room. The bed remained empty. Caleb stood. "Ranger," he called. No response. Only rain. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and stepped onto the porch. Cold air rushed against his face. The storm carried the scent of wet earth and distant pine. "Ranger." This time he heard something. Not a bark. Not a whine. A steady scratching sound. Rhythmic. Persistent. Coming from the far end of the field. Caleb swept the flashlight beam across the darkness. The light finally found him. Ranger stood beneath the ancient oak tree. Or rather, he was digging beneath it. Mud sprayed behind him with every movement. His powerful front legs worked furiously, claws tearing through soaked earth while rain streamed down his sable coat. The dog looked almost possessed by purpose. "What are you doing?" Caleb muttered. He started down the hill, boots sinking into wet grass. Ranger never stopped. Not even when Caleb came within 20 feet. Not even when he called his name again. The dog continued digging as though nothing else existed. Caleb reached him and grabbed the leash attached to his collar. Enough. Ranger finally paused. For a moment, everything seemed still. Rain, wind, darkness. Then the German Shepherd slowly turned his head. His amber eyes locked onto Caleb. There was no fear in them. No confusion. Only certainty. It was the same expression Caleb had seen on search and rescue dogs during deployments overseas. The look of an animal that knew exactly where it needed to be. Ranger glanced back toward the hole. Then, without hesitation, he resumed digging. Caleb frowned. The hole was already nearly 2 feet deep. Water pooled along the edges. Roots protruded from the soil like twisted fingers. Yet Ranger ignored the discomfort, ignored the storm, ignored everything except the ground beneath the oak. Then something strange happened. The dog suddenly stopped. He lowered his head and pressed one ear against the mud. Completely still. Listening. Caleb felt an unexpected chill move through him. Ranger remained frozen for several seconds before lifting his head again. He looked directly at Caleb. Then he let out a low sound, barely louder than a breath. Not a growl. Not a bark. Almost a plea. Another bolt of lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the tree's sprawling branches. For a split second, Caleb could have sworn the roots seemed to reach endlessly into the darkness below. Ranger stepped forward and began digging again. Faster now. Desperate. Determined. As if 18 years of silence were buried beneath that patch of earth and time itself was finally running out. Caleb barely slept after that night. Long after he managed to pull Ranger away from the oak tree and lead him back to the house, the image refused to leave his mind. The dog had not acted like an animal chasing a scent or searching for a buried bone. There had been intention in every movement. Purpose. The kind of focus Caleb remembered from Marines carrying out a mission when failure was not an option. Dawn arrived. Wrapped in fog, a pale gray blanket drifted across the fields, softening the outlines of fences, barns, and distant hills. The storm had passed, leaving behind the rich scent of wet grass and fresh earth. Caleb stood on the back porch with a cup of black coffee warming his hands. Ranger sat beside him. The German Shepherd appeared calm now, almost ordinary. His ears twitched occasionally at the sound of birds hidden somewhere in the mist. His tail rested quietly against the wooden boards. Yet every few moments his gaze returned to the oak tree. The same tree, the same place. Caleb followed his line of sight. The oak stood nearly 300 yards away at the edge of the property. Massive, ancient, unmoved by time. Its branches stretched wide enough to cast shade over half a football field during summer afternoons. When Caleb was a boy, he had believed the tree was alive in ways other trees were not. His father used to laugh whenever he said that. That old oak has seen more history than any of us, his father would tell him. Treat it with respect. Back then, the land had felt alive. Caleb and his younger brother Noah spent entire summers exploring every corner of the farm. They built forts from fallen branches, fished in the creek beyond the northern pasture, climbed the lower limbs of the oak despite repeated warnings from their mother. Some of Caleb's happiest memories lived beneath those branches. Some of his worst memories did too. He stared into the fog and felt the familiar ache return. Noah had been 12 years old the last time Caleb saw him. Caleb was 19 then, preparing to leave for Marine Corps training. The brothers had argued about something small and forgettable. A baseball glove, a broken bicycle chain. Neither of them could remember now, or at least Caleb could not. What he remembered clearly was Noah standing beneath the oak tree after the argument, kicking at the dirt and refusing to look up. Caleb had left the next morning. 2 weeks later, Noah disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation. Search teams looked for months. Volunteers searched fields, forests, roads, and rivers. Nothing. Eventually the town moved on. Life continued. But the Walker family never truly recovered. Caleb took another sip of coffee. Ranger suddenly stood. The movement was immediate and deliberate. The dog stepped off the porch and began walking across the yard. Not running. Not wandering. Walking with quiet determination toward the distant oak. Caleb sighed and set down his mug. You really are not giving up, are you? Ranger never looked back. 20 minutes later, they stood beneath the enormous branches once again. Morning light filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns across the damp ground. The hole from the previous night remained exactly where Ranger had left it. Mud covered the surrounding roots. Caleb expected the dog to begin digging immediately. Instead, Ranger approached the edge of the hole and lowered his nose toward the soil. He sniffed once, twice. Then he pawed gently at the ground. Something small shifted beneath a thin layer of mud. Caleb crouched beside him. At first it looked like nothing more than a scrap of metal. Then sunlight caught its surface. A dull brass gleam emerged from the dirt. Caleb carefully brushed away the mud with trembling fingers. His breath caught. Resting in his palm was a small whistle attached to a faded leather cord. Time had worn away much of its shine, but 2 engraved letters remained visible. N.W. For several seconds the world seemed to grow very quiet. Because Caleb knew exactly who that whistle had belonged to. Caleb stared at the whistle as rainwater from the previous night dripped slowly from the oak leaves above. The brass surface rested cold in his palm. 18 years. 18 years since anyone had seen it. He remembered the day he gave it to Noah as clearly as if it had happened that morning. Noah had been 10 years old and obsessed with adventure stories. Caleb had spent $6 at a hardware store in town and bought the whistle as a birthday gift. Now you can signal for rescue when you get lost, he had joked. Noah carried it everywhere after that. To the creek, to the barn, even to church until their mother finally made him leave it at home. Yet somehow it had ended up buried beneath the oak tree. Caleb swallowed hard and turned the whistle over. The leather cord was cracked with age, but the engraving remained unmistakable. N.W. Noah Walker. Beside him, Ranger sat perfectly still. The dog watched Caleb rather than the object. Watched him with a strange patience that made Caleb uneasy. How did you find this? He asked quietly. Ranger's ears twitched. That was all. Caleb hesitated, then lifted the whistle to his lips. The metal tasted faintly of dirt and time. He blew 3 short notes into the cool morning air. The sound carried across the empty field and faded into the distant hills. The reaction was immediate. Ranger dropped onto his stomach. Both front paws extended forward. Head low. Eyes locked on Caleb. Caleb froze. The command had not been spoken. The whistle alone had triggered it. Slowly he lowered the whistle. Ranger remained in position. Every muscle in Caleb's body tightened. He had never trained the dog to respond to that signal. Not once. In fact, he rarely used whistles at all. The German Shepherd had come from a rescue organization 6 months earlier. According to the paperwork, he had been found wandering near Knoxville, Tennessee. No owner, no identification, no history, just a calm, intelligent dog needing a home. Yet somehow he recognized a signal that only Noah had used growing up. Caleb's mind searched for a logical explanation. Perhaps another trainer had used similar commands. Perhaps it was coincidence. But deep down, the explanation felt too convenient. Ranger slowly stood and approached the edge of the hole. He sniffed once before scraping away another layer of damp soil. This time something else emerged. A corner of faded paper protected beneath a thin sheet of rusted metal. Caleb carefully knelt and pulled it free. His heart skipped. It was an old photograph. Water stains had blurred portions of the image, but the faces remained visible. 2 boys stood beneath the oak tree during a summer long ago. Caleb recognized himself immediately. Beside him stood Noah, grinning beneath a baseball cap several sizes too large. But that was not what caught Caleb's attention. A puppy sat between them. A German Shepherd puppy. Its ears were half upright, awkward and oversized. One ear leaned slightly to the left. The puppy wore a narrow leather collar with a small metal tag attached. Caleb brushed away mud covering the lower edge of the photograph. A name appeared beneath the image in faded black marker. Scout. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he looked at Ranger. The dog stood watching him. Amber eyes. Sable coat. The same slight tilt to the left ear. Not identical. Impossible. Yet similar enough to send a chill through him. Scout had belonged to Noah. The dog had died years ago according to his father. Everyone knew that. Yet standing beneath the oak tree, holding the photograph in one hand and the whistle in the other, Caleb could not shake the feeling that invisible threads were beginning to connect. Somewhere deep inside a puzzle that had remained frozen for 18 years had started moving again. Ranger suddenly turned toward the farmhouse. His ears lifted. His posture stiffened. Someone was approaching. A pickup truck appeared at the far end of the property, rolling slowly down the gravel lane toward the oak tree. And behind the steering wheel sat Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed had worked on the Walker property for nearly 30 years. He was 62 now, broad-shouldered despite his age, with weathered skin and silver hair that seemed permanently shaped by wind and sun. Caleb remembered him from childhood as a quiet man who always arrived before sunrise and left after dark. If a fence needed repair, Thomas handled it. If cattle wandered through a broken gate, Thomas found them. After Caleb's father grew older, Thomas had become more than an employee. He became part of the farm itself. The pickup rolled to a stop 50 feet from the oak tree. The engine fell silent. For a moment, neither man spoke. Thomas climbed out slowly and looked toward the hole in the ground. Something flickered across his face. Not surprise. Not exactly. More like recognition. Then it vanished. "Morning, Caleb," he called. "Morning." Thomas adjusted his cap and walked closer. Ranger immediately moved beside Caleb's leg. The German Shepherd was not growling, not barking, yet every muscle in his body seemed alert. Thomas noticed the dog, before glancing toward the whistle still resting in Caleb's hand. "You have been busy." Caleb held up the whistle. "Found this under the tree." Thomas stared at it longer than necessary. "Well now, that is something. You recognize it?" Thomas looked away toward the fields. "Your brother used to carry that thing everywhere." The answer came too quickly. Caleb felt a knot tighten inside his chest. "I also found this." He handed over the photograph. Thomas studied it silently. The morning breeze moved through the oak branches overhead. Somewhere beyond the pasture a crow called once and then fell quiet again. "Scout," Thomas finally said. "Good dog." Ranger's ears lifted at the name. Caleb noticed it immediately. So did Thomas. The older man's expression hardened for only a fraction of a second. Then it softened again. Funny how dogs remember things. Caleb took back the photograph. Ranger was never trained with that whistle. Yet he responds to Noah's signals. Thomas folded his arms. Maybe somebody else trained him that way. Maybe. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Yet neither man seemed convinced by it. Ranger suddenly stepped away from Caleb and began walking toward the farmhouse. He did not run. He simply moved with quiet certainty. After 20 yards, he stopped and looked back. Caleb frowned. "What now?" The German Shepherd waited. Then he continued. Caleb followed. Thomas hesitated before joining them. The dog led them across the property toward an aging equipment shed near the northern fence line. The structure had not been used in years. Paint peeled from the walls. Rust stained the metal roof. Weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation. Ranger stopped at the entrance. His nose worked the air carefully. Then he slipped inside. Caleb followed. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight cutting between loose wooden boards. The scent of old hay and machine oil lingered in the stale air. Ranger moved directly toward a corner stacked with forgotten crates. Without hesitation, he began scratching at the floor beneath them. Once, twice, 3 times. Caleb exchanged a glance with Thomas. Together they pulled the crates aside. Beneath them lay another object hidden under years of dust. It was a small wooden frame. Caleb picked it up carefully. Inside was another photograph. This one was newer than the first. Much newer. The edges were worn, but the image remained clear. A teenage boy stood beside a German shepherd near a roadside creek. The boy looked older than the Noah Caleb remembered. 17 perhaps. Maybe 18. His face was leaner, taller, older, but unmistakably Noah. Caleb's pulse quickened. The date written in the corner stopped him cold. It had been taken 6 years after Noah disappeared. Ranger sat quietly beside him. Thomas had gone pale. Outside, the wind suddenly stirred through the fields. And for the first time since returning home, Caleb realized the mystery beneath the oak tree was no longer about a disappearance. It was about where Noah had gone after everyone believed he was already gone. The evening settled gently over the small coastal town, painting the clinic windows with bands of amber light. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt water and distant pine, while inside, the steady rhythm of machines seemed almost comforting for the first time all day. Ethan remained seated beside Ranger's recovery kennel, his elbows resting on his knees, his tired eyes fixed on the shepherd's sleeping form. Hours earlier, the outcome had felt uncertain. Now there was something different in the room. Not certainty. Hope. Ranger's breathing had grown stronger. The rise and fall of his chest no longer looked like a struggle. It looked like a promise. Dr. Sarah Kim reviewed the latest chart beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp. Her expression remained professional, but the faint smile at the corner of her mouth revealed what the numbers already suggested. Progress. Real progress. Ethan noticed it immediately. He stood slowly and approached. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. Sarah looked up. "The truth is that he is fighting harder than anyone expected." Ethan exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for days. Behind them, the shepherd's ears twitched. A small movement, barely noticeable. Yet both of them turned instantly. Ranger's eyes opened. Only halfway at first. Clouded with exhaustion, then a little wider. His gaze drifted across the room until it found Ethan. For a moment neither moved. The world seemed to narrow into that single silent connection. The Marine felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Memories flooded back. Long patrols beneath unforgiving skies. Cold nights beside campfires. Countless moments when that same loyal dog had stood watch while others slept. Ranger tried to lift his head. The effort was small, but determined. Ethan stepped forward immediately. "Easy, partner." His voice cracked despite himself. The shepherd's tail tapped once against the blanket. Then again. Weak. Slow. But unmistakable. Sarah looked away for a second, giving the man his dignity. Some reunions deserved privacy, even in a crowded clinic. Ethan reached through the kennel door and rested his hand gently against Ranger's neck. The dog's eyes never left his face. No fear. No confusion. Only recognition. The kind built through years of trust. Outside, rain began falling softly against the windows. A peaceful rain. The kind that cleans the dust from old roads. The kind that makes the world feel new again. Ranger released a long breath and settled deeper into the blanket, comforted by the familiar touch. Ethan remained there beside him, unwilling to move. Not because he was afraid anymore, but because he finally understood something. Healing was rarely loud. Miracles rarely announced themselves. Sometimes they arrived as nothing more than a tired dog opening his eyes at the exact moment a lonely man needed to believe again. And as the evening deepened beyond the glass, the room filled with a quiet warmth that no machine could measure. For the first time since the nightmare began, both of them were finding their way home. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pale gray mist drifting in from the Atlantic. The town was still quiet when the first rays of sunlight touched the windows of Foster Veterinary Care. Inside, the clinic carried the familiar scent of antiseptic, warm coffee, and clean blankets. Ethan had not gone home. He sat in the same chair beside Ranger's kennel, his head resting against the wall, having drifted into only a few hours of sleep. A soft sound pulled him awake. He opened his eyes and immediately looked toward the shepherd. Ranger was standing. His legs trembled slightly, but he was standing. The sight hit Ethan harder than he expected. Yesterday, even lifting his head had seemed impossible. Now the dog was carefully testing his strength, amber eyes alert and focused. Ranger noticed Ethan watching and gave a slow wag of his tail. The movement was stronger than before, deliberate, proud, almost as if he were reporting for duty. Ethan laughed quietly and rubbed a hand across his face. "Look at you," he whispered, "always trying to prove something." Ranger stepped closer to the kennel door and pressed his nose against the metal grate. Ethan reached through and scratched behind his ears. The shepherd immediately leaned into the touch. Across the room, Sarah entered carrying a clipboard and paused when she saw them. The expression on her face softened. "I had a feeling today would be different." Ethan looked up. "He is not giving up." "No," Sarah replied. "Neither are you." Outside, the fog slowly lifted from the streets. Fishing boats began moving through the harbor. Seagulls cried overhead. Life continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that inside one small clinic, two wounded souls were quietly finding their footing again. Later that afternoon, Sarah cleared Ranger for a short walk outside. Ethan clipped a leash onto the shepherd's collar and pushed open the clinic door. Cool ocean air rushed in immediately. Ranger stopped on the sidewalk and simply stood there for a moment. His nose lifted toward the breeze. The scent of salt water, cedar, and distant rain seemed to wash over him. His ears twitched. His tail moved gently. Ethan watched in silence. Some victories were measured in miles. Others were measured in a single step taken after believing there would never be another. Ranger finally began walking. Slowly at first, then a little stronger. People passing nearby smiled when they saw the shepherd. An elderly fisherman tipped his cap. A young boy waved excitedly. Ranger accepted the attention with quiet dignity, never straying far from Ethan's side. As they reached the end of the block, the shepherd suddenly stopped. He turned and sat beside Ethan's leg exactly as he had done years ago during training exercises. Perfect posture, perfect focus, waiting for his next instruction. Ethan felt his throat tighten. For a long moment, he simply stared at his old friend. Then he placed a hand on Ranger's shoulder. Neither of them needed words. The storm that had nearly broken them was behind them now. Ahead lay uncertainty, healing, and time. But for the first time in a very long while, both Marine and dog were walking toward the future together. 3 weeks passed like a slow tide rolling across the shoreline. Summer sunlight lingered longer each evening, bathing the harbor in gold and copper reflections. The fishing boats returned daily. Children rode bicycles along the boardwalk. Life moved with its familiar rhythm. And little by little, Ranger returned to it. His coat regained its healthy shine. The hollowness that once shadowed his frame disappeared beneath steady meals and patient care. The limp in his stride faded until it became almost impossible to notice. Yet the greatest change was not physical. It lived somewhere deeper. Ethan saw it every morning. The shepherd no longer carried the distant look of a dog fighting to survive. Instead, there was peace in his eyes. The kind that comes when fear finally loosens its grip. One Saturday morning, Ethan parked his truck beside the marina and stepped out into warm sunshine. Ranger jumped down beside him with practiced ease. The air smelled of salt, fresh bait, and coffee drifting from nearby shops. A few people immediately recognized the shepherd. News of his recovery had quietly spread throughout town. An elderly woman who ran the bakery crossed the street carrying a small paper bag. "For your brave boy," she said with a smile. Ranger sat politely while Ethan accepted the homemade dog biscuits. The woman laughed softly. Best manners in the county. Ranger accepted the treat with gentle dignity, drawing smiles from everyone nearby. Moments like that became common. Wherever they went, people stopped to greet him. Children asked to pet him. Shop owners kept treats behind their counters. The shepherd never demanded attention, yet somehow it found him anyway. One afternoon, Ethan and Ranger returned to the beach where they had first met. The tide was low. Waves rolled lazily onto wet sand, leaving mirrors of sunlight behind. Seagulls drifted overhead. Ethan carried an old tennis ball in his hand. He turned it thoughtfully before tossing it across the shoreline. Ranger watched it bounce once, twice. Then he sprinted after it. Fast, strong, effortless. Ethan felt something shift inside him as he watched the dog race through the surf. Weeks earlier, he had feared this moment might never come. Ranger returned with the ball and dropped it at his feet, tail sweeping happily through the air. Ethan laughed. A real laugh. Unforced. The sound surprised him. He realized it had been a long time since joy arrived so naturally. The shepherd barked once and nudged the ball forward again. The message was clear. Throw it again. So Ethan did. The afternoon stretched on beneath a bright blue sky. For nearly an hour they walked the shoreline together. No rush. No destination. Only the simple gift of being there. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Ethan sat on a weathered driftwood log overlooking the ocean. Ranger settled beside him, pressing lightly against his leg. The familiar weight felt comforting. Steady. Real. Ethan rested a hand on the shepherd's neck and gazed across the endless water glowing beneath the setting sun. Some wounds never disappear completely. They become part of who we are. But sitting there with Ranger beside him, listening to the waves whisper against the shore, Ethan understood something he had forgotten during the darkest days. Healing does not always mean returning to who you were before. Sometimes it means becoming someone stronger because of what you survived together. Autumn arrived quietly along the North Carolina coast. The air turned cooler. The sunsets lingered longer across the water. Leaves painted shades of gold and crimson drifted through the town streets whenever the ocean breeze stirred. Months had passed since the long nights at the clinic, and life had settled into something neither Ethan nor Ranger had expected. Peace. Every morning began the same way. Ethan opened the front door of the small rental cottage overlooking the harbor, and Ranger stepped outside to inspect the world as if conducting an official patrol. The shepherd moved with confidence now. Strong, healthy, present. The shadows that once lingered behind his eyes had faded into memory. One Sunday afternoon, the town gathered near the waterfront for the annual Veterans Appreciation Festival. Families filled the boardwalk. American flags fluttered from lamp posts. Local musicians played beneath white tents while children chased one another through the grass. Ethan had not planned to attend. Crowds were never his favorite place. But Sarah insisted. Ranger seemed to agree. The shepherd had practically nudged him out the front door that morning. By late afternoon, they stood near the marina watching boats drift across sparkling water. Ranger remained close to Ethan's side, calm as always. Then something unexpected happened. A young Marine approached. He could not have been older than 22. His uniform was crisp. His posture was straight. Yet there was uncertainty behind his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying burdens alone. He stopped beside Ethan and glanced at Ranger. "Beautiful dog," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Best partner I ever had." The young Marine smiled faintly. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to continue. Then he did. They talked. First about dogs. Then about service. Then about loss. Nearly an hour passed. When the conversation finally ended, the younger man looked lighter somehow, as if speaking the weight aloud had helped carry it. Before leaving, he knelt beside Ranger. The shepherd gently rested his head against the Marine's shoulder. No command. No training. Just instinct. The young man swallowed hard and smiled. "Thank you, buddy." As he walked away, Ethan watched him disappear into the crowd. A strange warmth settled over him. Sometimes healing spreads farther than we realize. Sometimes the kindness that saves us becomes the kindness we unknowingly pass to someone else. The sun began sinking toward the horizon, turning the harbor into a sea of liquid gold. Music drifted softly. Across the water, families gathered for photographs. Children laughed. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang the evening hour. Ethan sat on a wooden bench overlooking the marina. Ranger lowered himself beside him, pressing against his leg the way he always did. Together they watched the final sunlight dance across the waves. Neither moved. Neither needed to. The moment felt complete exactly as it was. The years ahead would still bring storms. Every life carried them. But Ethan no longer feared them the way he once had. Because some lessons only arrive through hardship. Some gifts only reveal themselves after darkness. He looked down at Ranger and gently rested a hand on the shepherd's head. Ranger closed his eyes for a moment, content beneath the touch. Beyond them, the ocean stretched toward the horizon, endless and shining beneath the fading sky. And in that quiet coastal evening, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, two survivors sat side by side, grateful not for miracles that changed the world, but for the smaller miracle that had changed theirs. Winter returned to the coast 1 year later. The ocean carried a sharper wind now, and thin ribbons of frost appeared on rooftops before sunrise. Yet inside the small harbor town, warmth seemed to linger wherever Ethan and Ranger went. Their story had long since faded from local headlines, replaced by newer events and newer conversations. Neither of them minded. They had never wanted attention. They had only wanted another chance. On a quiet December evening, Ethan walked with Ranger along the marina just as he had done countless times before. Christmas lights reflected across the dark water. Small fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. The scent of pine wreaths and cinnamon drifted from nearby storefronts. The town looked peaceful beneath the glow of the season. Ranger moved beside him with steady confidence, his paws clicking softly against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. His muzzle carried a little more silver now. Not enough to make him old, but enough to remind Ethan that time never stops moving. They reached the end of the pier where the harbor opened toward the Atlantic. There Ethan stopped. The waves rolled beneath the moonlight in long silver lines. The same ocean, the same horizon, yet somehow everything felt different. Ranger settled beside him and gazed out across the water. Ethan smiled. You always did like watching the ocean. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. For a while, neither moved. The silence between them was comfortable, earned. Behind them, laughter drifted from a nearby restaurant. Somewhere farther down the harbor, church bells rang softly through the cold night air. Ethan found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The fear, the uncertainty, the long hours when hope felt fragile. Looking back now, none of it seemed wasted. The difficult days had shaped them. The hard miles had led them home. A small family approached along the boardwalk. A little girl separated from her parents and hurried toward Ranger. She could not have been older than 7. She stopped in front of him and smiled. Ranger responded with his usual patience, lowering his head so she could gently stroke his fur. He looks happy, she said. Ethan glanced down at the shepherd. Ranger's tail moved once against the wooden planks. Slow. Content. Yeah, Ethan answered softly. I think he is. The family continued on their way, disappearing among the holiday lights. Ethan watched them go before turning back toward the ocean. Above them, stars filled the winter sky. Bright, endless, quiet. The kind of sky that makes a person feel both small and deeply grateful at the same time. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's leg. The familiar gesture carried years of trust within it. Ethan placed a hand on the shepherd's neck and closed his eyes for a moment. Not in sadness. Not in prayer exactly. More like gratitude. The simple kind that asks for nothing and gives thanks for everything. The wind moved gently across the harbor. Boats rocked softly in the darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, tomorrow waited. But tonight there was only this moment. A marine, a loyal shepherd, a peaceful town beside the sea, and the quiet truth that some bonds do not need grand endings. They become part of the soul itself, living on through ordinary days, steady companionship, and the kind of love that never asks for recognition. The waves continued their endless journey toward shore, and beneath the winter stars, two old friends sat together, content in the grace they had found and the life they had been given.